So we begin with an editorial background note about this work from MIA. Formerly known as Herr Eugen Duhring's Revolution in Science, Engels' Anti-Duhring is a popular and enduring work, no pun intended, I guess, which, as Engels wrote to Marx, was an attempt to, quote, produce an encyclopedic survey of our conception of the philosophical, natural science, and historical problems, unquote. Marx and Engels first became aware of Professor Duhring with his December 1867 review of Capital, published in Ergänzungsblätter. They exchanged a series of letters about him from January to March 1868. He was largely forgotten until the mid-1870s, at which time Duhring entered Germany's political foreground. German Social Democrats were influenced by both his warning long German titles coming up, Kritische Geschichte der Nationalökonomie und des Sozialismus, and also Cursus der Philosophie als Strang wissenschaftlicher Weltanschauung und Lebensgestaltung. Among his readers were included Johann Most, Friedrich Wilhelm Fritzsche, Edward Bernstein, and even August Bebel for a brief period. In March 1874, the Social Democratic Workers' Party paper Volksstaat ran an anonymous article, actually penned by Bebel, favorably reviewing one of Duhring's books. On both February 1st and April 21st, 1878, Liebknecht encouraged Engels to take Duhring head-on in the pages of the Volksstaat. In February 1876, Engels fired an opening salvo with his Volksstaat article, Prussian Vodka in the German Reichstag. On May 24, 1876, Engels wrote Marx, saying that there was cause to initiate a campaign against the spread of Duhring's views. Marx replied the same day, saying Duhring himself should be sharply criticized. So Engels put aside his work on what would later become known as the book Dialectics of Nature. On May 28, he outlined to Marx the general strategy he planned to take against Duhring. It would take over 2 years to complete. The book breaks into 3 distinct parts. Part 1, Philosophy, written mainly between September 1876 and January 1877, published as a series of articles entitled Herrn Eugen Duhring's Umwälzung der Philosophie in Vorwärts between January and May 1877. Later, beginning in 1878, with the first separate edition, the first 2 chapters of this part were made into an independent general introduction to all 3 parts. Part 2, Political Economy, written mainly between June and August 1877. The last chapter was actually written by Marx. Published under the title Herrn Eugen Duhring's Umwälzung der politischen Ökonomie in Wissenschaftliche Beilage, and in the supplement to Vorwärts between July and December 1877. Part 3, Socialism, was written mainly between August 1877 and April 1878, published as Herrn Eugen Duhring's Umwälzung des Socialismus in the supplement to Vorwärts between May and July 1878. The Vorwärts serials elicited objections from Duhring's loyal adherents. During the May 27, 1877 Congress of the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, they attempted to ban the ongoing publication of it in the party paper. Indeed, the sporadic delays in publication were largely due to their efforts. In July 1877, Part 1 was published as a pamphlet. In July 1878, Parts 2 and 3 were combined into a second pamphlet. In early July 1878, the complete work was first published as a book, with an added preface by Engels. In October 1878, Germany's anti-socialist law was instituted, and Anti-Duhring was banned along with Engels' other works. In 1886, a second edition appeared in Zurich. The third, revised and supplemented edition was published in Stuttgart in 1894, i.e. after the anti-socialist law was repealed, 1890. This was the last edition during Engels' lifetime. It was translated into English for the first time in 1907 in Chicago. In 1880, at Paul Lafargue's request, Engels took 3 chapters of Anti-Duhring and created what would become one of the most popular socialist pamphlets in the world, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. So that's the end of MIA's introductory notes. Let's get into the text now, beginning with the prefaces. There are 3 prefaces: the original from 1878, the 1885 preface, and the 1894 preface. So, Preface 1, London, June 11, 1878. The following work is by no means the fruit of any inner urge. On the contrary, when 3 years ago, Herr Duhring, as an adept and at the same time a reformer of socialism, suddenly issued his challenge to his age, friends in Germany repeatedly urged on me their desire that I should subject this new socialist theory to a critical examination in the central organ of the Social Democratic Party, at that time the Volksstaat. They thought this absolutely necessary if the occasion for sectarian divisions and confusions were not once again to arise within the party, which was still so young and had but just achieved definite unity. They were in a better position than I was to judge the situation in Germany, and I was therefore duty-bound to accept their view. Moreover, it became apparent that the new convert was being welcomed by a section of the socialist press with a warmth which, it is true, was only extended to Herr Duhring's goodwill, but which at the same time also indicated that in this section of the party press there existed the goodwill, precisely on account of Herr Duhring's goodwill, to take also, without examination, Herr Duhring's doctrine into the bargain. There was, besides, people who were already preparing to spread this doctrine in a popularized form among the workers. And finally, Herr Duhring and his little sect were using all the arts of advertisement and intrigue to force the Volksstaat to take a definite stand in relation to the new doctrine, which had come forward with such mighty pretensions. Nevertheless, it was a year before I could make up my mind to neglect other work and get my teeth into this sour apple. It was the kind of apple that, once bitten into, had to be completely devoured, and it was not only very sour but also very large. The new socialist theory was presented as the ultimate practical fruit of a new philosophical system. It was therefore necessary to examine it in the context of this system, and in doing so, to examine the system itself. It was necessary to follow Herr Duhring into that vast territory in which he dealt with all things under the sun, and with some others as well. That was the origin of a series of articles which appeared in the Leipzig Forwards, the successor of the Volksstaat, from the beginning of 1877 onwards, and are here presented as a connected whole. It was thus the nature of the object itself which forced the criticism to go into such detail as is entirely out of proportion to the scientific content of this object, that is to say, of Duhring's writings. But there are also two other considerations which may excuse this length of treatment. On the one hand, it gave me, in connection with the very diverse subjects to be touched on here, the opportunity of setting forth in a positive form my views on controversial issues which are today of quite general scientific or practical interest. This has been done in every single chapter, and although this work cannot in any way aim at presenting another system as an alternative to Herr Duhring's, quote, system, yet it is to be hoped that the reader will not fail to observe the connection inherent in the various views which I have advanced. I have already had enough proof that, in this respect, my work has not been entirely fruitless. On the other hand, the, quote, system creating Herr Duhring is by no means an isolated phenomenon in contemporary Germany. For some time now, in German systems of cosmogony, of philosophy of nature in general, of politics, of economics, etc., have been springing up by the dozen overnight like mushrooms. The most insignificant Dr. Philosophy, and even a student, will not go in for anything less than a complete, quote, system. Just as in the modern state it is presumed that every citizen is competent to pass judgment on all the issues on which he is called to vote, and just as in economics it is assumed that every consumer is a connoisseur of all the commodities which they have occasion to buy for their maintenance, so similar assumptions are now to be made in science. Freedom of science is taken to mean that people write on every subject which they have not studied, and put this forward as the only strictly scientific method. Herr Duhring, however, is one of the most characteristic types of this bumptious pseudoscience, which in Germany nowadays is forcing its way to the front everywhere, and is drowning everything with its resounding sublime nonsense. Sublime nonsense in poetry, in philosophy, in politics, in economics, in historiography, sublime nonsense in the lecture room and on the platform, sublime nonsense everywhere, sublime nonsense which lays claim to a superiority and depth of thought, distinguishing it from the simple, commonplace nonsense of other nations. Sublime nonsense, the most characteristic mass product of Germany's intellectual industry, cheap but bad, just like other German-made goods, only that unfortunately it was not exhibited along with them at Philadelphia. Even German socialism has lately, particularly since Herr Dühring's good example, gone in for a considerable amount of sublime nonsense, producing various persons who give themselves airs about science, of which they never really learnt a word. This is an infantile disease which marks, and is inseparable from, the incipient conversion of the German student to social democracy, but which our workers, with their remarkably healthy nature, will undoubtedly overcome. It was not my fault that I had to follow Herr Dühring into realms where at best I can only claim to be a dilettante. In such cases I have for the most part limited myself to putting forward the correct, undisputed facts in opposition to my adversary's false or distorted assertions. This applies to jurisprudence, and in some instances also to natural science. In other cases, it has been a question of general views connected with the theory of natural science, that is, a field where even the professional natural scientist is compelled to pass beyond their own specialty and encroach on neighboring territory on which they are therefore, as Herr Virchow has admitted, just as much a semi-initiate as any one of us. I hope that in respect of minor inexactitudes and clumsiness of expression, I shall be granted the same indulgence as is shown to one another in this domain. Just as I was completing this preface, I received a publisher's notice, composed by Herr Dühring, of a new, quote, authoritative work of Herr Dühring's, Neue Grundgesetze zur rationellen Physik und Chemie, a work on physics and chemistry. Conscious as I am of the inadequacy of my knowledge of physics and chemistry, I nevertheless believe that I know my Herr Dühring, and therefore, without having seen the work itself, think that I am entitled to say in advance that the laws of physics and chemistry put forward in it will be worthy to take their place, by their erroneousness or platitudinousness, among the laws of economics, world schematism, etc., which were discovered earlier by Herr Dühring and are examined in this book of mine, and also that the rigometer, or instrument constructed by Herr Dühring for measuring extremely low temperatures, will serve as a measure not of temperatures either high or low, but simply and solely the ignorant arrogance of Herr Dühring. London, June 11, 1878. Preface number 2, the 1885 preface. I had not expected that a new edition of this book would have to be published. The subject matter of its criticism is now practically forgotten. The work itself was not only available to many thousands of readers in the form of a series of articles published in the Leipzig Vorwärts in 1877 and 1878, but also appeared in its entirety as a separate book, of which a large edition was printed. How then can anyone still be interested in what I had to say about Herr Dühring years ago? I smile here because obviously it's 2022, and this is still making the recommended reading list of many socialist parties. Continuing. I think that I owe this in the first place to the fact that this book, as in general almost all my works that were still current at the time, was prohibited within the German Empire immediately after the anti-socialist law was promulgated. To anyone whose brain has not been ossified by the hereditary bureaucratic prejudices of the countries of the Holy Alliance, the effect of this measure must have been self-evident. A doubled and tripled sale of the prohibited books, and the exposure of the impotence of the gentlemen in Berlin who issue prohibitions and are unable to enforce them. Indeed, the kindness of the imperial government has brought me more new editions of my minor works than I could really cope with. I have had no time to make a proper revision of the text, and in most cases have been obliged simply to allow it to be reprinted as it stood. But there was also another factor. The, quote, system of Herr Dühring, which is criticized in this book, ranges over a very wide theoretical domain, and I was compelled to follow him wherever he went, and to oppose my conceptions to his. As a result, my negative criticism became positive. The polemic was transformed into a more or less connected exposition of the dialectical method and of the communist world outlook championed by Marx and myself, an exposition covering a fairly comprehensive range of subjects. After its first presentation to the world in Marx's Poverty of Philosophy and in the Communist Manifesto, this mode of outlook of ours, having passed through an incubation period of fully 20 years before the publication of Capital, has been more and more rapidly extending its influence among ever-widening circles. It now finds recognition and support far beyond the boundaries of Europe, in every country which contains on the one hand proletarians, and on the other undaunted scientific theoreticians. It seems, therefore, that there is a public whose interest in the subject is great enough for them to take into the bargain the polemic against the Duhring tenets merely for the sake of the positive conceptions developed alongside this polemic, in spite of the fact that the latter has now largely lost its point. I must note in passing that inasmuch as the mode of outlook expounded in this book was founded and developed in far greater measure by Marx, and only to an insignificant degree by myself, it was self-understood between us that this exposition of mine should not be issued without his knowledge. I read the whole manuscript to him before it was printed, and the 10th chapter of the part on economics, from Kritische Geschichte, was written by Marx, but unfortunately had to be shortened somewhat by me for purely external reasons. As a matter of fact, we had always been accustomed to help each other out in special subjects. With the exception of one chapter, the present new edition is an unaltered reprint of the former edition. For one thing, I had no time for a thoroughgoing revision, although there was much in the presentation that I should have liked to alter. Besides, I am under the obligation to prepare for the press the manuscripts which Marx has left, and this is much more important than anything else. Then again, my conscience rebels against making any alterations. The book is a polemic, and I think that I owe it to my adversary not to improve anything in my work when he is unable to improve his. I could only claim the right to make a rejoinder to Herr Duhring's reply, but I have not read and will not read, unless there is some special reason to do so, what Herr Duhring has written concerning my attack. In point of theory, I have finished with him. Besides, I must observe the rules of decency in literary warfare all the more strictly in his regard because of the despicable injustice that has been done to him by the University of Berlin. It is true that the university has not gone unpunished. The university which so abases itself as to deprive Herr Duhring, in circumstances which are well known, of his academic freedom must not be surprised to find Herr Schwenninger forced on it in circumstances which are equally well known. The only chapter in which I have allowed myself some additional elucidation is the second of Part 3, Theoretical. This chapter deals simply and solely with the exposition of a pivotal point in the mode of outlook for which I stand, and my adversary cannot therefore complain if I attempt to state it in a more popular form, and to make it more coherent. And there was in fact an extraneous reason for doing this. I had revised 3 chapters of the book, the first chapter of the introduction, and the first and second of Part 3, for my friend Lafargue, with a view to their translation into French, and publication as a separate pamphlet, and after the French edition had served as the basis for the Italian and Polish editions, a German edition was issued by me under the title Die Entwicklung des Sozialismus von der Utopie zur Wissenschaft. This ran through 3 editions within a few months, and also appeared in Russian and Danish translations. In all these editions, it was only the chapter in question which had been amplified, and it would have been pedantic, in the new edition of the original work, to have tied myself down to its original text, instead of the later text, which had become known internationally. Whatever else I should have liked to alter relates in the main to 2 points. First, to the history of primitive society, the key to which was provided by Morgan only in 1877. But as I have since then had the opportunity, in my work, Origins of the Family, Private Property in the State, to work up the material which in the meantime had become available to me, a reference to this later work meets the case. The second point concerns the section dealing with theoretical natural science. There is much that is clumsy in my exposition, and much of it could be expressed today in a clearer and more definite form. I have not allowed myself the right to improve this section, and for that very reason am under an obligation to criticize myself here instead. Marx and I were pretty well the only people to rescue conscious dialectics from German idealist philosophy, and apply it in the materialist conception of nature and history. But a knowledge of mathematics and natural science is essential to a conception of nature which is dialectical and at the same time materialist. Marx was well versed in mathematics, but we could keep up with natural science only piecemeal, intermittently, and sporadically. For this reason, when I retired from business and transferred my home to London, thus enabling myself to give the necessary time to it, I went through as complete as possible a molting, as Liebig calls it, in mathematics and the natural sciences, and spent the best part of 8 years on it. I was right in the middle of this molting process when it happened that I had to occupy myself with Herr Duhring's so-called natural philosophy. It was therefore only too natural that in dealing with the subject I was sometimes unable to find the correct technical expression and in general moved with considerable clumsiness in the field of theoretical natural science. On the other hand, my lack of assurance in this field, which I had not yet overcome, made me cautious, and I cannot be charged with real blunders in relation to the facts known at that time or with incorrect presentation of recognized theories. In this connection, there was only one unrecognized genius of a mathematician who complained in a letter to Marx that I had made a wanton attack upon the honor of the square root of -1. It goes without saying that my recapitulation of mathematics and the natural sciences was undertaken in order to convince myself also in detail of what in general I was not in doubt, that in nature, amid the welter of innumerable changes, the same dialectical laws of motion force their way through as those which in history govern the apparent fortuitousness of events. The same laws which similarly form the thread running through the history of the development of human thought and gradually rise to consciousness in thinking people. The laws which Hegel first developed in all-embracing but mystic form, and which we made it one of our aims to strip of this mystic form, demystifying, and to bring clearly before the mind in their complete simplicity and universality. It goes without saying that the old philosophy of nature, in spite of its real value and the many fruitful seeds it contained, was unable to satisfy us. As is more fully brought out in this book, natural philosophy, particularly in the Hegelian form, erred because it did not concede to nature any development in time, any succession, but only coexistence. This was, on the one hand, grounded in the Hegelian system itself, which ascribed historical evolution only to the, quote, spirit, but on the other hand was also due to the whole state of the natural sciences in that period. In this, Hegel fell far behind Kant, whose nebular theory had already indicated the origin of the solar system, and whose discovery of the retardation of the Earth's rotation by the tides had proclaimed the doom of that system. And finally, to me, there could be no question of building the laws of dialectics into nature, but of discovering them in it and evolving them from it. But to do this systematically and in each separate department is a gigantic task. Not only is the domain to be mastered almost boundless, natural science in this entire domain is itself undergoing such a mighty process of being revolutionized that even people who can devote the whole of their spare time to it can hardly keep pace. Since Karl Marx's death, however, my time has been requisitioned for more urgent duties, and I have therefore been compelled to lay aside my work. For the present, I must content myself with the indications given in this book, and must wait to find some later opportunity to put together and publish the results which I have arrived at, perhaps in conjunction with the extremely important mathematical manuscripts left by Marx. Yet the advance of theoretical natural science may possibly make my work to a great extent, or even altogether, superfluous. For the revolution which is being forced on theoretical natural science by the mere need to set in order the purely empirical discoveries, great masses of which have been piling up, is of such a kind that it must bring the dialectical character of natural processes more and more to the consciousness even of those empiricists who are most opposed to it. The old rigid antagonisms, the sharp, impassable dividing lines, are more and more disappearing. Even since the last, quote, true gases have been liquefied, and since it has been proved that a body can be brought into a condition in which the liquid and the gaseous forms are indistinguishable, the aggregate states have lost the last relics of their former absolute character. With the thesis of the kinetic theory of gases, that in perfect gases at equal temperatures, the squares of the speeds with which the individual gas molecules move are in inverse ratio to their molecular weights, heat also takes its place directly among the forms of motion which can be immediately measured as such. Whereas only 10 years ago, the great basic law of motion, then recently discovered, was as yet conceived merely as a law of the conservation of energy, as the mere expression of the indestructibility and uncreatability of motion. That is, merely in its quantitative aspect, this narrow negative conception is being more and more supplanted by the positive idea of the transformation of energy, in which, for the first time, the qualitative content of the process comes into its own, and the last vestige of an extra-mundane creator is obliterated. That the quantity of motion, so-called energy, remains unaltered when it is transformed from kinetic energy, so-called mechanical force, into electricity, heat, potential energy, etc., and vice versa, no longer needs to be preached as something new. It serves as the already secured basis for the now much more pregnant investigation into the very process of transformation, the great basic process, knowledge of which comprises all knowledge of nature. And since biology has been pursued in the light of the theory of evolution, one rigid boundary line of classification after another has been swept away in the domain of organic nature. The almost unclassifiable intermediate links are growing daily more numerous. Closer investigation throws organisms out of one class into another, and distinguishing characteristics which almost became articles of faith are losing their absolute validity. We now have mammals that lay eggs, and if the report is confirmed, also birds that walk on all fours. Years ago, Virchow was compelled, following on the discovery of the cell, to dissolve the unity of the individual animal being into a federation of cell states, thus acting more progressively rather than scientifically and dialectically. And now the conception of animal, therefore also human, individuality is becoming far more complex, owing to the discovery of the white blood corpuscles, which creep about amoeba-like within the bodies of the higher animals. It is, however, precisely the polar antagonisms put forward as irreconcilable and insoluble, the forcibly fixed lines of demarcation and class distinctions, which have given modern theoretical natural science its restricted, metaphysical character. The recognition that these antagonisms and distinctions, though to be found in nature, are only of relative validity, and that, on the other hand, their imagined rigidity and absolute validity have been introduced into nature only by our reflective minds. This recognition is the kernel of the dialectical conception of nature. It is possible to arrive at this recognition because the accumulating facts of natural science compel us to do so, but one arrives at it more easily if one approaches the dialectical character of these facts equipped with an understanding of the laws of dialectical thought. In any case, natural science has now advanced so far that it can no longer escape dialectical generalization. However, it will make this process easier for itself if it does not lose sight of the fact that the results in which its experiences are summarized are concepts, that the art of working with concepts is not inborn and is also not given with ordinary everyday consciousness, but requires real thought, and that this thought similarly has a long empirical history, not more and not less than empirical natural science. Only by learning to assimilate the results of the development of philosophy during the past 2,500 years will it rid itself, on the one hand, of any natural philosophy standing apart from it, outside it, and above it, and on the other hand, also of its own limited method of thought, which is its inheritance from English empiricism. London, September 23, 1885. Preface 3, 1894. The following new edition is a reprint of the former, except for a few very unimportant stylistic changes. It is only in one chapter, the 10th of Part 2, from Kritische Geschichte, that I have allowed myself to make substantial additions, on the following grounds. As already stated in the preface to the second edition, this chapter was, in all essentials, the work of Marx. I was forced to make considerable cuts in Marx's manuscript, which in its first wording had been intended as an article for a journal, and I had to cut precisely those parts of it in which the critique of Duhring's propositions was overshadowed by Marx's own revelations from the history of economics. But this is just the section of the manuscript which is even today of the greatest and most permanent interest. I consider myself under an obligation to give in as full and faithful a form as possible the passages in which Marx assigns to people like Petty, North, Locke, and Hume their appropriate place in the genesis of classical political economy, and even more, his explanation of Quesnay's economic tableau, which has remained an insoluble riddle of the Sphinx to all modern political economy. On the other hand, wherever the thread of the argument makes this possible, I have omitted passages which refer exclusively to Herr Duhring's writings. For the rest, I may well be perfectly satisfied to the degree to which, since the previous edition of this book was issued, the views maintained in it have penetrated into the social consciousness of scientific circles and of the working class in every civilized country of the world. London, May 23, 1894, F. Engels.